Thank you, Senator Urquhart. Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise to dedicate this speech tonight to all the people who were too young to cast a vote on September 7, 2013. I'm proud to stand here today as a member of the Australian Greens in defence of the Climate Change Authority, an entity which most Australians could be forgiven for not even knowing existed until quite recently. The Climate Change Authority reviews Australia's emission reduction goals and progress towards the renewable energy target every 2 years from 2012, and it performs this essential task free from interference from the Executive and from the Parliament. Now, this independence is essential. It operates in the same way as the Reserve Bank sets interest rates, independently of the superficial political churn that can so often dominate debates in here. That independence is important precisely because the role of the authority needs to be guided by science and not by politics. In setting the pace of economy-wide emissions reductions, powerful interests are impacted, interests with open checkbooks and strong opinions, with direct access to this morning's cabinet meeting and tomorrow morning's newspaper headlines. Does anyone remember the retro-sounding phrase evidence-based policy? It sounds kind of quaint and naive as it rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? So far, you've abolished more than 20 expert authorities across the board, from the High Speed Rail Advisory Group to the National Housing Supply Council. You're like a pilot punching out the dials on the instrument panel one by one, even as the engines falter and the light fades. The Climate Change Authority, though, is the big one. With this single act of calculated stupidity, you are smashing the only legislative guidance that you've got as to the speed and the urgency of the transition that is demanded of you. If you somehow wrangle the numbers to wreck the Climate Change Authority, you really will be flying blind. You're left waving around a feeble 5% emissions target without the faintest idea of how to get there or what on earth you plan on doing with the other 95%. So much for evidence-based policy. We plunge headlong into the realm of making it up as you go along-based policy, except that when you fly blind and hit the wall on climate policy, you take everyone else down with you. I know the Prime Minister has been told by his minders to pretend that he no longer thinks climate change is crap. The government's tactical masterminds have settled on a rather more dishonest messaging strategy, where you say, sure, we believe in climate change, we just think we can tick it off more cheaply by shoveling money into the mouths of rent-seekers and LNP candidates in marginal seats and calling it direct action. You might as well just set fire to the money. And yes, the climate has changed in the past. Senator McDonald was at it again on Monday and a short while ago in this debate. And I don't want to pick on my colleague from Queensland because this attitude now corrupts the whole Liberal National Party. It's the combination of self-confident stridency and breathtaking ignorance that makes it so difficult to have a sensible conversation. Yes, the climate has changed in the past. 240 million years ago, the Earth was a desert planet. 15,000 years ago, Earth was in the deep winter of a planetary ice age, with the sea levels so low that you could walk out to Wodjima, a Rottnest island, which now lies 18 kilometres west of the port of Fremantle. The climate can change profoundly and very rapidly relative to geological timescales, and that is Year 5 primary school science. So somewhere between Year 5 and, say, Year 9 high school class, Senator McDonald and a substantial number of his colleagues must have just nodded off, and they missed some very important early high school science classes. Why would you want to take a system as delicately balanced as the global climate system that you know can be thrown in a matter of centuries or millennia into quite a different regime and put a blowtorch on it? Take something as complex and powerful as the atmosphere itself and then dump tens of billions of tonnes of thermally opaque gases into it every single year. And then when the place begins to heat up, more or less exactly as predicted, you stand back and pretend that it's a total coincidence, because after all, the climate has changed in the past without being shoved by fossil capitalism. Joseph Fourier theorised about the insulating properties of the atmosphere in 1824, although the key role of carbon dioxide as a thermal blanket wasn't spelled out until Svante Arrhenius published his greenhouse law back in 1896. The work done by NASA or CSIRO or every single one of the world's national science academies on climate change research still rests on evidence that was tested more than a century ago. Now, it's actually fine for senators in the Liberal and National parties to come in here and wave your scientific illiteracy at people as though it's some sort of strange badge of honour. It is actually fine, and I mean it. You shouldn't have to be an oceanographer or an atmospheric physicist to be a good legislator. But if you don't have these qualifications yourself, the least you can do is show basic respect to those who do have those qualifications and listen to what it is that they're telling you. What they're telling you is, and I'll break it down into smallish words, is that burning coal and oil and gas is cooking the place. We need to stop doing that. I'm sorry that it offends your donors in the coal industry. I understand that it is also quite inconvenient for your benefactors in the gas industry. The problem is allowing them to continue to undermine international climate agreements and poison domestic politics here, as they've done in the United States and elsewhere, is going to end up being quite inconvenient for everybody else. Let me explain what I mean by inconvenience. In the 30-year campaign to sabotage meaningful international negotiations, your donors and your benefactors in the coal and gas industry have already committed us to dangerous global warming. The increased violence of storms as we've loaded more heat into the atmosphere and ocean, the perceptible sea level rise, the droughts, the consequent security instability and war in places like Darfur as Lake Chad disappeared off the map. If we had followed through with the concerted efforts to front up to global warming in the 1980s and 1990s when the issue first hit real global political prominence, we might have been able to avoid some of the storms that we're now sailing into. But instead, the coal, oil and gas industries did everything they could to attack and undermine that global consensus as it was emerging. And so now we live in a world in which dangerous global warming is a reality. To get a sense of what this government is driving us into, look no further than today's approval of the Abbott Point coal terminal. This government is pressing on regardless, flying blind, not into a world with 2 degrees of average warming, but potentially with 4 or more. Now, whether it be Abbott Point, whether it be the beach at James Price Point in the West Kimberley, where a huge gas proposal is afoot, whether it be the multiple gas fracking operations that are underway or planned right around this ancient continent, whether it is the predominance of freeway building over public transport, or the proposal for the southwest forest to increase logging in old growth and high conservation value forests. All around us we see the same sad expressions of business as usual. And they are taking us from a world where we could potentially survive, and you could conceivably see a world of 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warming. That would be very, very damaging, difficult place to live, but manageable, not end of civilization stuff, something that we could deal with if we move into it with our eyes open. But I want to talk now about what happens if we continue with the kind of business as usual that is on display this afternoon at Abbott Point and everywhere else around the country, and that is 4 degrees of global warming. And I commend senators to a book called 4 Degrees of Global Warming, Australia in a Hot World, edited by Peter Christoph. What this book tells us, the best models that we have, and it's like predicting the weather, it's not a precise science, but it is nonetheless a science. The best expertise that we have, the best models that we have. 250,000 coastal properties inundated by rising sea levels at a total cost of around $63 billion. 17,200 heat-related deaths a year, up from 5,800 today. Snow, just a distant memory in all but the very highest of alpine peaks on the east coast. 250 million people in the Asia-Pacific region displaced. And by 2100, in a 4-degree world, you've locked in irreversible loss of the Greenland ice sheet, which effectively buys you 7 or more metres of sea level rise, not in this century, but in those to come. And I know, and it's glad that Senator McDonald's rejoined us again, because I fully understand, and the Greens understand, that maintaining the Climate Change Authority, maintaining the carbon price and ramping it up, guiding that transition here in Australia, will not prevent those things if that's all we do. This needs to be internationally coordinated action. We need the kind of sabotage that is occurring here in Australia tonight to cease and desist in the United States, in Western Europe, in the emerging economies in India and Asia. We fully understand that this is a global problem and a global issue. And so we call on those industries who are saying here in Australia, and they're advocates in this very parliament, who say we shouldn't do anything here until a global agreement has been reached, to cease and desist sabotaging those global agreements. In a 4-degree world, our cities and entire climate systems are basically unrecognisable. And there are some very interesting studies in this book about what are the analogues, what are the closest analogues of climates in these future decades in a 4-degree world. Sydney, in one scenario, ends up like Rockhampton in subtropical Queensland. Melbourne gets something that looks a bit more like Griffith in regional New South Wales. Alice Springs mirrors the modern-day Sudan, and the vast majority of interior of Australia becomes effectively uninhabitable. And the average annual temperature at Alice rises to 35.5 degrees at the hottest, driest scenario. That's their average. Darwin, there is no analogue for. Darwin will be like no other city on Earth. There's no climate system or climate zone on planet Earth at the moment that matches what Darwinians will be living with in that 4-degree world in the year 2100. And Perth, of course, my hometown, will be an entirely different place. 3 to 4.8 degrees warmer, 50% less rainfall on top of what we've already lost in the southwest, 5 to 16 greater ranges of evaporation, which will exacerbate the frequency of drought, increased heat waves. It is effectively the depopulation of the northern wheat belt, which destroys a $2 billion industry and wipes out communities that have existed for more than 150 years. That is what we are buying, and that is the choice that is before us. At 3.5 degrees, this most recent collection of essays tells us up to 67% of frogs, 80% of mammals, 64% of reptiles and 72% of birds are committed to extinction in that 4-degree world. 85 to 90% of suitable habitat is lost. So we are setting in motion, in actions like the government proposes to take tonight, mass extinction, not just here in the Australian Parliament, actions in the West Australian Parliament, actions in the United States Congress, actions in the Japanese Diet, in the Indian Parliament, all around the world. These actions collectively are committing us to a mass extinction. And I want to raise this issue tonight. This is something that has come to me from the internet. I don't know, it emerged online. I don't know who invented it. It stands for the species. It's called the extinction symbol. And it is meant to stand for the species that we are thoughtlessly dispatching to the silence of geology. And it also speaks to us of a choice, of the choices that we've made that brought us here, and the choices that we make tonight in votes like this and those to come, about what kind of a species extinction we lock in for those decades to come. I've sought leave of the whips before to table this, and I think it's about time that the extinction symbol, as a reminder to all of us who make these decisions in votes like this one today, as a reminder on the Hansard record. So I have checked this with the whips a short time ago, and I'll just seek leave to table that now.
Is leave granted? Yes.
Thanks, Mr. Acting Deputy President. And against this imperative, Prime Minister Tony Abbott posts a YouTube video on his way overseas, demanding that the Senate do the right thing. Are you serious? Sorry, Sunshine, the sound bites and the shallow slogans that carried you through the election campaign into the Prime Minister's office have just hit the wall.
Yes, I did. Sorry, Senator Ludlam, please refer to the Prime Minister by his title.
Are you saying that calling the Prime Minister Sunshine is unparliamentary, Mr. Acting Deputy President? I'll withdraw it if that's the case.
Yes, I am, Senator.
I will withdraw that if that's the case. I could think of other things, but that felt like it would suffice. In 2008, in the very first speech that I read in here, I told an apocryphal story that seemed appropriate at the time. It was about a group of washerwomen at a riverbank who noticed a child floating past the river in trouble. And one of them wades in and rescues the child. And then a short while later, they see another child floating past and they go out and rescue that one. And then another one floats by, and then another, and before long they're overwhelmed. And then one of the women turns and she makes her way up the riverbank. And the other women demand, "Comrade, where are you going? We need you here." And without looking back, she says, "I'm going to find whoever it is who's throwing them in." And I feel as though I've spent with my colleagues 5 years in this place, working my way upstream to find out who it is throwing these kids into harm's way, who is making these repetitive short-term decisions that set such long-term disasters into motion. And here you are. We found you. If anything that we've said tonight reaches any members of the coalition with a flicker of conscience, join us when we put this bill to a vote, cross the floor and vote for a bill that will give us a fighting chance to meet the challenges that our country has only just begun to confront. You can join the Greens, you can join the Labor Party. You'll also be joining the solar industry, companies like Solar Reserve that just established an office in Perth and are hoping to roll out some of the projects at scale like those that they're doing in the western part of the United States. You'll be joining the wind energy developers. You'll be joining the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. You'll be joining campaigners and ordinary people all over the planet who are throwing everything that they have at changing course while we still can. So when we commit this bill to a vote, I know where I'll be sitting. I thank the Chamber.